I've never had the chance to ask you, Joe and Justin, how you ended up collaborating with each other on this project. And since you've never met, obviously it went well, and you both stuck with it.
Yeah,
How'd
we
that go?
haven't met, but we've collaborated for, we've corresponded for decades now, right? Through emails and,
Yeah.
on ZNet and stuff, on the forums, and then by phone, then by, chat, just got easier and easier to correspond,
So Joe, I think you just had I think Joe was originally going to do a book about media.
Right.
And then I think it just got more and more focused on the Venezuela case. Is that right, Joe?
Yeah, I was going to try to make it more general, just more generalized to Latin America. Then I thought, no, it's better to just do a specific case study, be more focused. Just see, because if you do something more general, it can start to ramble, or you go into a lot of topics very superficially. I don't know, it seemed to work better to focus on one case.
I like the cover of your book. Very powerful.
Yeah, we had a good cover designer.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm curious. Sorry, go ahead, Justin.
No, I worked with the graphic artist a little bit because he had a few ideas and we went over them. And the whole gunboat diplomacy thing was just so stark, right? So that was kind of where we went with it.
If you don't mind, now that I've gotten a little background on you two meeting each other many years before writing this together, how do you know Maria and Greg? And how did that happen that they're here with us today?
Maria and I have a really good story, actually.
Go ahead.
Because I knew Maria for a few years, starting around 2001 or 2, or I don't know, 3. At least by 2004, we knew each other well because Venezuela, and I was very active in Colombia solidarity. And then I got a job at York where Maria's husband works, and I was working in the same faculty as Maria's husband. And I knew they were both named Victor, but I never made the connection at all. And then one time I was sitting in the faculty lounge with Peter Victor, who's also like a well-known kind of eminent environmental economist. And we were talking and he was like, hey, I think he asked me like with like a real like mischievous kind of look. And he was like, do you know Maria Victor? And I was like, oh yeah, she's a good friend of mine. And he's like, well, your good friend is my wife. So
he was quite taken aback that I knew you.
What other? Yeah, he's just like, what other good friends do you have, Maria, that I've never heard of?
He said, I met a nice young handsome fellow who says he's your friend. Oh no, that was such a long time ago. It's amazing how time flies. And then of course we went to Venezuela together, remember? We took about 11 other professors and we gave them a pretty good view of what was happening in Venezuela. We took them everywhere, huh? Yeah. Remember that? That was really good.
To those of you who are right on time, sorry, Justin, we're going to give people about 7 minutes to join us, maybe late after a long work day. And so I was just asking Joe and Justin to tell us how they know Maria and Greg. And we're about to hear from Justin, I guess, about how he knows Greg.
Well, Greg was, we all wrote for Z Magazine and ZNet together. And there were these, in the early 2000s, Z used to send these daily commentaries. So it was like a newsletter almost, but it would be like one writer a day. So there was like 2 days in a row that it was Greg. I think I mentioned this last time we talked, and it was like April 10th or something. It was like coup in Venezuela ? And then April 11th, it was like coup in Venezuela ! And I was like, oh my God. Anyway, so that I was like, okay, I need to talk to this guy because he knows what's going on there.
Yeah. I remember that, I foreshadowed the coup the day before it happened, which wasn't too difficult, actually. I mean, anybody was paying attention could have guessed, but it, yeah, it still came as a surprise, I guess. I mean,
canción de huesos chilenos, de lo profundo de adentro, canción para los valientes, que la cante Víctor Jara, una canción de Violeta, para el compañero Allende.
Welcome to MR Conversations, a new live online series launching today with the latest book from MR Press. Extraordinary Threat, the US Empire, the Media, and 20 Years of Coup Attempts in Venezuela is a primer for answering questions like, what is the nature of Venezuela's government? What would happen to Venezuela if it fell to US imperialism? And how has the US been able to get away with this? We encourage you to get your own copy of Extraordinary Threat at monthlyreview.org/product/extraordinary-threat. Perhaps you're familiar with the reference to which the title refers. In 2015, President Obama declared the situation in Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to US national security and foreign policy, proclaimed a national emergency, and slammed sanctions against Venezuela. In their solidly sourced book, Joe Emersberger and Justin Podur demonstrate the opposite. It is in fact US policy, leading as it has to 6 coup attempts and the deaths of tens of thousands of people due to sanctions, that constitutes an extraordinary threat to Venezuelans. Taking Venezuela as a case study, how does regime change propaganda work? And we're even going to challenge the use of the phrase regime change as we go. Especially given yesterday's assassination of Haitian President Moïse by a group proclaiming in strong American accents that they were from the US DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, I'm sure we are eager to understand what we can learn from the 6 coup attempts in Venezuela and how they might apply elsewhere. Here to guide us through these and other questions are co-authors Joe Emersberger and Justin Podur, and their guests Maria Paez Victor and Greg Wilpert. So to begin with, Joe Emersberger is an engineer, writer, and activist based in Canada. His writing, focused on the Western media's coverage of the Americas, can be found on fair.org, counterpunch.org, zcom.org, and Monthly Review, among many other publications. Justin Podur is Associate Professor at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University in Canada. He is the author of Haiti's New Dictatorship, Siege Breakers, and America's Wars on Democracy in Rwanda and the DR Congo. Justin and Joe have invited 2 guests to join us. To begin with, Maria Paez Victor is a Venezuelan-born sociologist who produces the only radio program exclusively on Venezuela in Canada on the Spanish language radio station in Toronto. She taught for several years at the University of Toronto and then held senior level positions in the Toronto Health System, Energy System, Law Society, and the Ontario Legislature. She's the founder of the Luis Riel Bolivarian Circle and of the Canadian, Latin American, and Caribbean Policy Center. Greg Wilpert is a German-American sociologist and journalist who lived in Venezuela between 2000 and 2008 and has written extensively about it. He is co-founder of the website Venezuela Analysis, director of the Telesur English website, and currently he works as deputy editor at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And now we're going to queue up some footage from the documentary. The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. We'll have that in the background as we climb into our subject matter today. Today, we're going to start by looking closely at the mechanics of what the US likes to call regime change. Let's see what we can glean from the regime change playbook that the US has subjected Venezuela to and see if we can discern its successful tricks and its failed charades. we're going to begin by grounding ourselves in specifics and tell the story as if we're on the ground. The right person to start with then seems to be Greg, since he was there in 2002 when things popped off. So Greg, could you bring us there with a description of some of what you experienced during one of the US's attempted coups?
Yes, I mean, it's been a while now, almost 20 years, 19 years to be precise, since it happened. So it feels like, I mean, even though it was, 2 decades ago, it doesn't feel that long ago actually to me, because this was a very momentous time. I had arrived in Venezuela in the year 2000 and started teaching at the Central University of Venezuela, and was kind of observing the developments in Venezuela as I guess you could say, a sympathetic bystander. I wasn't really involved. I was a little bit skeptical of Chavez, just as many people on the left were. Actually, we're still a little bit skeptical of him because he came from the military. And even though I knew Chavez's background, he had even talked and flirted with, the third way politics and so on. He hadn't really been that clear as to what he really wanted in some ways. That is, he wanted to revolutionize the country, certainly, but it was still kind of vague. But things really started to change and heat up. First of all, when, of course, he helped bring about a new constitution that was passed in 1999, in late 1999. And then there were major elections in 2000 where he got reelected. And then in 2001 was when he really seemed to indicate which direction he was heading. That is, there were 49 laws that were passed with permission of the National Assembly, were passed as law decrees, so-called. And that really revolutionized, or tried to revolutionize and deeply change the way Venezuela's economy functioned. It was really, I think that was, I mean, of course, at that time, there were a lot of people who were still very opposed to Chavez, but one of the main things was that the opposition to Chavez became really strong when those laws were proposed, those 49 law decrees. And this was in late 2001. So, and throughout the 6-month period, really, between the passage of those laws and the coup that then happened in April of 2002, things started to really heat up, and I started paying attention. In other words, up until then, I wasn't really paying that careful attention. But one general after another would come up and start denouncing the government, which seemed really bizarre. You'd had to have these generals coming up and saying, we denounced the government, and calling basically openly for an overthrow of the government. And so you saw something was about to happen. Something was really heating up. And as a matter of fact, things got so tense with lots of demonstrations, of course, from the opposition, that by April 10th, I actually wrote an article suggesting that there might be a coup in the works. I didn't know when, but I wrote an article for ZNet at the time suggesting that there was an imminent coup. Actually, the title of the article was "An Imminent Coup in Venezuela?" ? And lo and behold, on April 11th, that's when it happened. And I mean, we didn't know, of course, in the morning of April 11th, there was going to be a major opposition demonstration, and there was a pro-government demonstration as well. I decided to go to the pro-Chavez demonstration to see what was happening with my own eyes, and it was very difficult to get to because there were police everywhere. The whole area around the presidential palace had been cordoned off. There were pro and anti-government demonstrators. And I made it through to this notorious place called Puente Yaguno, and became notorious, and it wasn't at the time, called Puente Yaguno, which is the Yaguno Bridge, an overpass. And I noticed that people were shooting at each other. Was actually what was happening, what I could witness was that the first thing I saw, I was kind of shocked to see that pro-Chavez demonstrators were shooting towards the street below. But then I saw that the street below was practically empty except for police. So in other words, the police were shooting at them and they were shooting back. And this was, very, I should say, it was very clear what was happening in that sense, that the police had taken the side of the anti-government demonstrators and were shooting at the pro-Chavez protesters, and they were returning the fire. After a while, things calmed down, and I returned to my home to start writing again. And I had CNN International on, which was reporting on these things. And to my shock and actually horror, I heard CNN saying that almost the opposite of what I had witnessed, which was that CNN was telling everybody that pro-government demonstrators were shooting at unarmed opposition demonstrators below the bridge. There was no evidence whatsoever of this. There was a pro-government demonstration much further back, with outside of the reach of pistol fire, which is what they were using, was pistols. Anyway, I was absolutely flabbergasted that they were repeating basically the lies that the opposition was spreading. And this continued to happen for the next 2 days. And I was just completely overwhelmed with the amount of work that had to be done, basically, of trying to counter the opposition lies. Because the mainstream media was repeating it over and over again. Luckily, some news outlets, discovered what I was writing and would call me up and so on. And some of them, but only very few, would present this what I consider to be the actual story of what was happening. So anyway, this was the real shock for me. I can go into much more detail, but the other big thing I wanted to mention, though, since this book is also about U.S. involvement, was, of course, that the U.S. government repeated that lie, opposition lie, and said that there was a vacuum of power, when to everybody else, and I think most people in the opposition too, actually, if they were honest, it was obvious that this was a coup. But the U.S. State Department spokesperson was saying that this was basically a vacuum of power, and Chavez had resigned, and basically presenting it as a legitimate transfer of power, even though, as we saw in the footage earlier, the opposition just willy-nilly dissolved all of the institutions of government at the time, with no basis, constitutional basis whatsoever. And so this was, for me, the clearest evidence there could possibly be of U.S. involvement in the coup. That is, even if we didn't have any evidence, and there was some evidence of other kinds of involvement, this was probably the most powerful evidence and powerful involvement to give the U.S. stamp of approval for what was happening.
And they were so ready, right? They were so ready to, like, the New York Times was ready with their, this was great. The State Department, the spokespeople were ready with their statements recognizing the new government and the transition, immediately saying that the government had lost legitimacy because of this massacre. And I mean, the Puente Yaguno footage, some of the most, is deconstructed in that film, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. But there's also a documentary, I think sponsored by the Venezuelan government, called Puente Yaguno, Las Claves de una Masacre, where all they do is, it's one of the coolest documentaries you'll ever see, actually. It's like a forensic analysis of every bit of footage that they were able to find about that incident.
No, can I interrupt? Can I interrupt?
No,
Sure.
You're not interrupting at all. Go ahead.
Please.
It's really important, Justin, that you said that they were ready.
Yeah.
One of the reasons they were ready, because this whole coup was programmed hand in hand with the Venezuelan elite. So the Venezuelan elite, very sophisticated, they all speak English, they've all been to Harvard, right? They had all the connections. They had all those foreign media lined up. And actually, these people knew beforehand what was going to happen. This is why they were so ready, so prepared. The Chavistas, of course, had no kind of connections of that sort.
When I went in 2004 to study the opposition referendum, that was the big referendum, right? The recall referendum. That was 04.
Yeah.
in 2004 when I went, I met a lot of people, a lot of Chavistas who were like, they're not gonna catch us, they're not gonna catch us unprepared this time. And they had like media rooms and monitors, and yeah, they were very methodical about their media operations.
Yeah, I just want to mention one thing real quick. It's really important that people know that the New York Times editorial board immediately celebrated the coup. That this was the rescue of democracy. So they immediately, and this was it wasn't even, we call it an attempt, but it was actually successful. I mean, there was, for all the talk about Venezuela being a dictatorship, that accusation's been thrown out there for decades. But the only time Venezuela was actually in dictatorship was for those 2 days when Pedro Carmona annulled the Constitution and dissolved the Supreme Court, fired all the elected officials, and the New York Times editorial immediately applauded, and they weren't the only ones, obviously, and so that's very important. It was actually successful, and so it became impossible to deny, because sometimes when the United States their allies have attempted coups in another country, one of the talking points becomes, it wasn't really a coup. For example, in 2010 against Correa, right, when he was briefly held hostage, they said, it was just a show. He's exaggerating or even lying about it. But this was impossible to deny because they totally seized power for long enough that there was no denying what they did. And so afterwards, it was very difficult for them to reclaim credibility in a lot of places. But still, they never left. Several months later, they went into the second coup attempt, which was the destruction of the oil industry, which, although, I mean, it produced a severe contraction in the economy, but it was one of the worst contractions that Venezuela had gone through for decades. So that was already within several months later. So by the time, Chavez gets elected in 98, wins a bunch of elections for the Constituent Assembly, gets reelected, wins a lot of elections, and then still he's overthrown, and he's called the dictator, but it's interesting is that at the time, early on in Chavez's administration, the media was more honest in the sense that they mentioned the grinding poverty in Venezuela that brought Chavez to power. But when you skip ahead 20 years, suddenly that's totally written out of the story. Now it was once prosperous Venezuela, right? That the Chavistas ruined. But it's funny how the story evolved. Basically, they changed their story as circumstances changed. And the other thing I want to quickly mention is it's really important is we mentioned in the book is the Auditor General, the State Department's Auditor General, did an investigation only months after the coup, and concluded that the U.S. government was providing funding and all kinds of support to people who were involved in the coup. But then, of course, they made this ridiculous conclusion. But to them, that still wasn't enough evidence that this was a big deal or that we really wanted the coup to happen. Which was crazy. But still, they recognized themselves that they were intimately involved, and with all the people who were involved in the coup. And then other information came out later that fleshed it out some more. Through the work of Jeremy Bigwood and Eva Gollinger. But again, so this is the first major attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government, and they kept at it. And we go over six major coup attempts.
And do you want to jump in, Rebecca?
I wanted to make space for Maria, but go ahead, Justin, and then I'll transition.
Just and Maria, maybe you can address this too, but it does raise an interesting question about, like, if being really, I would say, forgiving of the coup plotters may have been wise for Chavez at the time. I don't know, but it does, like, when you see, for example, that Nicaragua is punishing the coup plotters in Nicaragua, or Bolivia is punishing the coup plotters in Bolivia, and the reaction that the U.S. has, where they're saying, you shouldn't do this. This is repressive, and being sort of tolerant and permissive of the coup, the golpistas, of 2000. it didn't really help Chavez's reputation. It's not like the U.S. then said, "Oh, look, this is a good example of how you should treat people who try to do a coup." They still called him all the names. They still continued the coup attempt. So I wonder, like, what that means for a country that's got people trying to overthrow them and a government. How do you think how much repression is too much, or how much repression is appropriate for that kind of crime?
Well, I have to say that when Chavez was brought back and they finally gave him a microphone and he was able to address, because all the government news areas had been taken down, they finally were able to give him a microphone. I felt such pride in Chavez when he said to the people, "Go back home," because I tell you, if he had said, "Go out and get these people," there would have been a massacre. Everybody knew where everybody lived. They would have gone out and looted and killed these people. And I think that today Chavez is up there in heaven because he won that heaven, that moment when he stopped the terrible violence that would have happened there. But today is a different thing altogether. The upper classes in Venezuela have acted so heinously against their own people that I don't think there would be forgiveness today. I'll give you an example. During the terrible oil lockout, Chavez was going crazy because this was the biggest thing that ever happened. The economy just tanked, stopped, everything stopped during the oil lockout. And he was so disturbed that he said, this I heard from his own lips, he said he couldn't sleep. So he said, "I can't be in here." And he walked out, and his people following him. And he started walking along the poor areas. And as he's walking along this one poor area, a woman shouts out to him, "Chavez, Chavez, ven acá, Chavez." They called him like that. "Chavez, come." And she insisted that she come into her little house. And there was a fire on the floor. Something was burning. And she said to him, "You see that? That's my last chair. I'm burning that chair so that I can cook." And then Chavez said, "She took hold of my shirt and shook me." This little old woman shook Chavez, the president and said, "Chavez, no te rindas." He said, "Chavez, don't give up." And she said, "I'll burn all my furniture, but don't you give up." I saw the children with varicose veins because they were carrying water up and down those hills for their mothers and grandmothers and everything. And they showed me these 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds with varicose veins because of the heaviness. And the man said to me, "We'll never forget what they've done to our children." There's not going to be this sort of forgiveness after what the upper classes have done with the sanctions and of being the partners of those who are oppressing Venezuela. That wonderful moment, I don't think it's going to happen again.
For those who are not as well versed as you all are, obviously, can you explain a little bit more about what happened with the oil crisis, maybe some of the chronology, and how it maybe represents one of the many tactics in the playbook, in the regime change playbook? And I'll start with Joe. Yeah, go ahead.
Talk about the second coup attempt when they shut down the oil industry. Yeah, that was the shutting down the production, because Chavez still hadn't. He was elected in '98, took office in '99, but he still had to fight like crazy to try to get control of the state oil company, PDVSA, which was the cash cow of basically the entire economy, not just the government. So he had a battle for control of that, and he tried to appoint board members that would basically make the state oil company accountable to the government, and that was a major battle. And so the second major coup attempt, the opposition, the anti-Chavez management basically shut down the state oil company, and that like I said earlier, that produced one of the worst contractions, GDP per capita contractions in Venezuela's economy that had taken place in decades. It was basically, and some of the, and we go over that in the book, some of the reporting, even in the corporate media, was kind of, they quoted opposition people being blunt about this. Yeah, the idea is to just produce enough economic pain that people just say, okay, Chavez, get out, you know. And if by 2003, Venezuelans were actually worse off than when Chavez first took office. It wasn't until after he won that battle for the oil company that you had this prolonged period, many years, until Chavez's death, and even shortly after, where the economy is recovering and poverty is being alleviated and inequality is being reduced. All these good things are happening, but he had to win that crucial battle for the state oil company, and they ended up having to fire like tens of thousands of people who collaborated with the strike. So that was a huge victory.
And when you say playbook, Rebecca, it's like in when they overthrew Salvador Allende in Chile, there was an explicit policy. I think it was called "Make the Economy Scream." There was quotes, from U.S. officials saying, "I don't want one, screw, one nail, one hammer." Like they were very specific about how they want to make the economy scream. They want to make it impossible for them to run their economy, and that was, of course, so it's definitely a playbook, right, that they were doing it in Venezuela 30 years later. They also, I mean, the what was amazing about it in terms of the Chavista response was how they actually they actually outmaneuvered that whole operation. So and I'm gonna ask Maria to tell some of these stories, but they got engineering students to take over some of the most complicated technical infrastructure in the world. So these students were like, "Congratulations, you're in charge of the oil rig." And there were, that they turned some of the offices that were vacated by management into the Bolivarian University classrooms. So there were all kinds of amazing things that happened as a result of the revolution winning those battles. But yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Some people would even argue that the 1-2 blow of first the coup in April of 2002, and then in December 2002, the oil industry shut down, that the reactions to those actually strengthened the Bolivarian movement tremendously. Yeah. In the first case, it was well, like I said, many people were kind of apathetic in some sense still with regard to Chavez, but that really consolidated his support, gathered people around him, and was a kind of a real political consolidation. But then kind of the oil industry shutdown created a kind of more economic consolidation, because one of the other things that they did, and this is many people don't realize this, in addition to shutting the oil industry, they also tried to shut down the distribution of food in Venezuela systematically. And so alternative networks for food distribution had to be set up, and this was done on a grassroots level. So this created a new kind of galvanization of the grassroots movements, actually, in reaction to the oil industry shutdown that went far beyond just the reactivating the oil industry, which was very important too. Actually, a lot of people who had retired from the oil industry went back, and like you've mentioned, the engineering students, but also Iranians came over and helped as well. And so there was a lot of from all around allies and so on helped reactivate it. But I think equally important was also this kind of grassroots movement that really laid the foundation stones for the Bolivarian movement in the long run. So that was, and so the other thing I wanted to mention is that this playbook, as we mentioned, is of course replaying itself to some extent now with the sanctions that were started in 2015 and then intensified by Trump in 2017, with also a grassroots reaction to those sanctions and trying to reactivate the economy. Of course, it's much more difficult now because the problem is much more complex, and the U.S. is much more powerful than just, so to speak, dealing with the oil industry. But anyway, I think those are important things to keep in mind.
One of the issues that happened during the oil lockout, because it wasn't a strike, it was a lockout by the top directory, okay, was that the workers said to the government, we don't need management. We can run this without the management. And workers of all levels who were retired, as Greg has said, came because the government was begging people to come to work. And I know for sure, because I spoke with the people who were sort of secretaries and such, and they said, oh no, we have a pact with the upper management. And I would say to them, you fool, what do you mean you have a pact with the upper management? They're going to end up in Miami with their millions, and you're going to end up without a job. And of course, this is what happened. It wasn't so much that Chavez fired, of course he did fire the top echelons, but also the law of Venezuela says if you don't go to your work for 4 days, every day for 4 days, without giving a reason why you are absent, you are automatically fired. And this law went into effect. But the problem was that it is a highly computerized industry. So when these traders left the PDVSA, they took with them the passwords of this, everything was computerized. And this is what these young 18-year-old engineering students had to figure out. I have friends who were in there working, you know, trying to get things on. None of them got paid because they didn't have the passwords to pay them. And so you know what would happen? Ex-PDVSA people would phone them up and say, you didn't get paid and you're working there like crazy. I'm not working, but I get paid. So the people who were outside were able to get their salary, and the people inside who were working weren't. Well, all I can say to you is that the story of PDVSA, of the engineering students, of the workers, of the retired people who came, of the people in Maracaibo and Puerto La Cruz, so with their bodies, they made you know, a wall to protect the boats, and the captains who took over the Peling Leon, big ship that was there. All of these are heroic things that happened. And the feeding of the people and giving them water, the pumps didn't work. There was no electricity. It was a terrible situation. But the grassroots are the ones who spontaneously came out of the woodwork to help each other. And now with the sanctions, well, those grassroots are now really organized. And this is why Venezuela hasn't sunk under the sanctions. It has been because the heroic and amazing organization of the grassroots, centro comunales, las comunas, los colectivos. Venezuela is no longer what it was in 2004. It is un pueblo organizado, an organized people.
The other thing I just want to say, like, I work at a university, York University. It has a very strong union, and you think, you know, they go on strike there's a university strike every few years, and you think of a strike, and, you know, at York University, there's a strike, and there's students walking at certain points, and they let the cars wait for 2 minutes before they let them onto campus, and it's all very circumscribed and very within the rules. And so, like, you might, if you're following this from that kind of context, it's not a strike. Like, what happened in Venezuela was not a strike in that sense. It was sabotage, it was theft, it was, you know, purposeful destruction. It would, you know, the analogy would be if the teaching assistants were, you know, burning campus down and, you know, smashing equipment and so on, which, you know, they never, you know, they don't do.
Yeah, I think it's very important to point out that actually the largest union of PDVSA at the time did not support the shutdown of the oil industry. That's why I always insist on calling it, at the very least, a shutdown and never a strike, because it really wasn't.
A lockout. It was a lockout of the top brass. And you're right, Greg. The union of PDVSA seeped with people from Acción Democrática. They hated the government, and they were, along with Fede Cámaras, instigators on the opposition party, instigators of this. That's what they've lost. Now, of course, the union is composed of very different people. So when people here in Canada, in the United States said, oh, the unions are against, they were talking about these ADECOs, these Acción Democrática people who were running the very corrupt unions, which they hardly even had elections.
So it looks like we went into a little bit about the cooperatives, and I think that was actually a question that was asked us prior to this, and I'm wondering if any of you have answers as far as the status of the cooperatives at this point.
What's the question, sir?
The status of the cooperative project.
Colectivos, I guess, right? Is that what you're?
The communes.
Yeah.
Las comunas.
Well,
there's an article on Venezuela analysis about one of them very recently, the Che Guevara commune. I don't know if you guys have seen that one. But I mean, I would just say real upfront that the whole point of imperialist pressure is to force concessions to the right-wing sectors. I mean, that's the whole point, right? So as the pressure intensifies, so does the pressure to make concessions to them. So if people in Canada and the United States are worried about, if they actually are sincerely worried about Maduro or even Chavez, about he's always making concessions to the right wing or to, well, the way to help with that is to alleviate the aggression that's aimed at forcing those concessions. And that's really our responsibility is to alleviate that pressure.
Venezuela will never be the same because of the consejos comunales and because of the communes. I've been at many of the meetings of these neighborhood and village, I don't know what to call them in English except communes and communal councils. And they are a process where the people learn about self-management, about governing, about taking the decisions that are most important to their communities. But also they are very also political because they are united with the other communal councils. And what has happened with these collectives is something that Paulo Freire spoke about 30, 40 years ago in Brazil. This was a great educator, Paulo Freire, who talked about the education of people who are adult education, how to teach them how to read and write. And he said, you don't teach them like you do children. He said, the most important thing is concientización. You have to help people be conscious of where they are in society. What are the things, the factors that press upon them and how they can have degrees of freedom through all of this, to be conscious. And of course, Marx talked about this too, when he talked about a class in of itself. This is what's happened in Venezuela. That's why I say it's not going to change. Because how do you take that out of their minds when they have learned by action, how to feed each other, how to help each other in all of these situations. Venezuela has been alone right now in front of these terrible sanctions, except because of the people who have organized and help each other. I don't say alone because we have had wonderful help through China and Russia and Cuba, okay? Great friends. But to feed the entire country when we couldn't buy food, and now we're growing it. How are we growing 80% of the food? Through the communal councils, through the communes, through the agriculturalists and the collectives there. I have a very large family, and some of my sisters belong to these communal councils. One on a rural one on an urban one, and I'm flabbergasted at how they are organized and how they have helped. And with the COVID, they have been relentless in helping the government to keep the COVID down. How come they're not all dead? You kind of think when we can't buy medicines. Well, it has been a great, I hope one of you, Joe or Justin, I hope your next book is about the communal councils and the colectivos.
Well, I have, been to a lot of, I've seen a lot of these things in action in different parts of the world. I saw in Argentina, they had asambleas in 2003 during the economic crisis there. And I saw some of them at work, and I've been to Colombia, indigenous processes in Cauca, and I've been to Chiapas. I've seen it in Chiapas with the Zapatistas. And the thing is, Venezuela, they have these assemblies, they have these local decision-making bodies. And I noticed, in Venezuela that those, back in 2004, this was 2004, when I visited a lot of these, that the better organized they were, the more they were able to do for their members, and the more they were able to access the kinds of resources that the state was trying to provide. And, if you think about what you expect a dictatorship to do, you would expect a dictatorship to reduce local initiative, to demobilize people, to tell them to, be apathetic and don't organize yourselves and don't talk to each other and don't form these social bonds and don't learn how to be self-reliant. You would think that would be how a dictatorship would behave. So that would be a useful criteria for some political scientists to apply, to say, okay, if this is how dictatorships behave, or if this is how anti-democratic regimes behave, how are they doing? What are they doing to people who are trying to organize themselves? Well, they're giving them resources, and they're giving them, documents and organizational ideas and connections to other people in other parts of the country. So
yeah. Well, the dictatorship charge isn't based on, it's one of those things that's based on just repetition. And when we talked about tactics, it relies on a lot of different people repeating the same line. So, Trump calls Venezuela a dictatorship, but then so does Justin Trudeau, and that's important because Canada, as we showed in the book, it's actually very well respected in the United States.
It's probably changing now with every mass grave that's unearthed.
It's a government that actually has credibility, more credibility than Trump has with a lot of people in the United States. It's same with the European Union, right? So he gets international allies, key Western governments to say the same thing, then that helps him. And then you get liberals, the liberal end of the spectrum, they also cave. They also say the same thing. We talk about Bernie Sanders, Ro Khanna. They repeat the same basic topic point. They demonize Maduro, and then so they always they want to oppose Trump, but in a very narrow tactical way. You see this over and over again. It was the same in the 80s against Nicaragua, by the way. It was always a very narrow. And Chomsky used to talk about this a lot. How the debate about foreign policy is so narrow. It's about tactics. It's not about the basics. So the basics are always reinforced by everybody. And we were talking about Haiti earlier, but I think before we were live, the coup in 2004, that to me really opened my eyes about how the human rights organizations, the pernicious role, the really destructive role they play in reinforcing the basic demonization of a government that the United States wants to overthrow, but also how there's always, and we didn't even get into this in the book because there's so many different media to focus on, but there's also so-called leftists who always crop up, and it doesn't matter whether it's in Haiti in 2004 or in Bolivia in 2019, but there's always people crop up with some kind of so-called left-wing analysis that basically just reinforces the fact that, yeah, this government's, don't worry about them being overthrown, they were no good anyway. Basically, that's the basic message.
Yeah, which they did with Bolivia and the whole extractivism
kind
of trope. And
yeah, it's like there's a flavor of propaganda for everybody that's supplied for every to legitimize. I think Maria was right. Instead of regime change, we should just call it aggression. It's one word and it's more to the point. Because regime change is kind of a shorthand that's become popular, but I'm not fond of it. I don't like the word regime, first of all. It's just a vague negative word that means nothing. You know, you can apply it to any government. There's no definition for it. So yeah, those are the things to consider. One thing I wanted to mention real quick, because Maria mentioned COVID, is that, you know, one struggle that any government that tries to reform, to attempt any kind of social reform, is that it's the professional / managerial class is always going to be an issue. In Venezuela's case, the doctors, the Douglas Natera, the head of the medical federation in Venezuela, he was a total supporter of the coup in 2002, the April 2002 coup, and the medical federation. Even in 2001, they went on strike. They were always against the government. They're always at war with the government. They launched lawsuits to try to keep the Cuban doctors out, because Chavez used the Cuban doctors to kind of bypass the medical establishment to get healthcare services to people. And even today, they're telling people not to take the Cuban vaccine that's just been developed. You know, and there's NGO, and even I think it was Reuters who reported this. Might have been Reuters, or might have been the other, but it was a corporate outlet who just said, just blandly, just without commenting on it, that NGOs and the medical community in Venezuela are telling people not to take the Cuban vaccine. And if you think about it, that's just incredibly evil. So it's a big problem that any is to develop a professional class that actually is going to at least be cooperative in trying to improve the lives of the people. Because in Venezuela, much of the medical establishment's just been just totally on board with the most vile right-wing sectors.
Well, it's always been, which is why they brought Cubans,
right?
Which is why the Cubans had such a big role in the medical system in particular.
When Chavez first started in his first term, he realized the terrible situation with respect to medical services that there was. So he got this idea, well, I'm going to call the doctors and we're going to make a new a program and have our doctors go into the poor areas. And he made a call to the Venezuelan doctors. You know how many he got for this humanitarian push? 53. So that's when he called Cuba. And then when the Cubans came, of course, that was a different thing altogether. But I want to come back to the COVID. This is hurting the upper and middle class, not the people. Why? Because the people, for all this time, who have been their doctors, the Cubans and the Venezuelans that work in Barrio Adentro, they're not listening to this guy, head of the profession. It's funny because I know upper class people who are desperate to get a vaccine, and very sheepishly, they go to the poor areas, you know, dressed very humbly in order to get the vaccine. But from the mouth out, they are saying terrible things, you know. They are the ones who are suffering from their own stupidity. But the people aren't listening to this a professional kind of leadership because of the wonderful work that Cuba has done in Venezuela. And I don't mean just the Cuban doctors. They also created a new Cuban, a new curricula for the profession of medicine. So all the young doctors in Venezuela, they have gone through a completely different medical school situation than the old doctors who are there. And so this is why the Venezuelan COVID situation isn't as disastrous as it is in Peru and Colombia and Brazil and everything. There's only been, I think, very few deaths in Venezuela, one of the lowest deaths per million. Yeah. And that is because, and I come back to the communal councils, to the communes, to the collective. The government itself couldn't have done all this if it hadn't had the work of all these people and the campaign, the educational campaign of I protect you by wearing a mask, you protect me by wearing a mask. This is all over what they have done. And so it's been another I would say, achievement of the conscientization, of the process of education that the Bolivarian Revolution has done. And I just want to give you one example about the organization of communal councils. One of the most terrible things that the United States did to Venezuela was when it had the cyber attack against our electricity. We have one gigantic dam where most of the electricity comes from, and there was a cyber attack, and Venezuela did not have electricity for 5 days. Just imagine a blackout for 5 days. No water, no elevators, no street lights, nothing, okay? So this was very, very scary. Well, again, things happened and they were able to change the computers. Again, this was a computerized thing, and we got over it. But a few months ago, there was a blackout in Caracas. It was a blackout. Now, whenever there's a blackout, people panic. My sister, who's 80 years old, was very worried, blackout. And they're all thinking, is this the attack? Are they coming to attack us? This is the first thing that they think of. She got a phone call in about 10 minutes of the blackout. The communal councils of her area, which is an urban one, telling her, Señora, don't worry. This is not an attack. There was a fire in such and such installation. It's very localized. Don't you worry. You'll soon have the light. These were the communal council telling people, don't worry. We know what's happening. This is why I'm saying the type of organization that's happening right now in the year 2021 is very different from the year 2004. And that's why I say Venezuela has changed.
So we've gone into, that was just yet another example of the mechanisms of what the US loves to call regime change, as if it was a matter of simply changing military uniforms, right? We've talked about, obviously we all know that there's the tendency to appoint a successor after a series of assassination attempts. We have rolling protests, we have aid-related charades of various kinds, and then we have sanctions. The question is, what is it that we can learn from all of this? Can we apply these lessons? And yes, we're playing this clip from the revolution. Will not be televised, partially because this is a key moment in which everything is happening very fast. Maybe we can look at this for a minute, and then it'll jog our memory, and we can think about what are some lessons learned.
These are some of my favorite scenes from the movie. It's just like so real. Like the people, these are like such real people. they're just like at work, and they're like, okay, well.
That's Chavez's brother there.
We've got to uncoup ourselves. How do we do this? So where's Chavez?
I want to ask Greg maybe to chime in, because you've been silent for a while, and since you were there, what is this bringing up for you?
You mean the images here now, or I mean,
yeah.
I think also kind of tying into your question about the lessons, and I think we've already gone over it, but I just want to reemphasize the biggest lesson is really kind of the grassroots mobilization and organization. Now, at that time of the coup, of course, people were not that well organized. The communal councils had not existed yet. So what it was really kind of a catalyzing moment to get people to organize. And now this happened on two different levels. I saw in the comments somewhere somebody commenting about organizing people from above versus from below. And actually both happened in Venezuela. That is, the government on the one hand created this Ministry of the Communes and tried to organize communal councils from above, but they also started popping up from the bottom. That is, they had created a kind of the legal infrastructure for them, and people could just create communes wherever they wanted to, as long as they met certain legal requirements for creating them, and they were relatively simple. And so I think this is crucial, this kind of confluence of from above and from below. That is the government's encouragement of the creation of communal councils and communes, and at the same time, people, of course, doing it on their own, which was pushed forward through these events, through these catalyzing or mobilizing events that happened, which were basically the 6 coup attempts that Justin and Joe talk about in their book. Or 6, not coup attempts, but 6 attempts to overthrow the government, essentially. So that's I think one of the key lessons. The other lesson that I would highlight, which we haven't really talked about, is of course the element of international solidarity. And I'm not just talking about kind of grassroots solidarity. I think that's very important, but also at the time, you had the beginnings of this kind of so-called pink tide, but the creation of leftist governments throughout the region were absolutely essential later on in preventing coups, particularly against Evo Morales in Bolivia. That is the first one I'm talking about. I can't remember the year now, but I'm not talking about the one from a year and a half ago. But the one
there was one in 2008, I think.
Yeah, something. I think it was 2008. And then the one against Rafael Correa in 2010, having kind of UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations, exist at the time as an alternative to the Organization of American States. I think that's absolutely crucial. Now, unfortunately, you had a period now of right-wing governments, so that didn't that element isn't as strong anymore. But I think this is for left governments to be aware of the possibility or of the U.S. imperialism and its actions. They need to be prepared for that eventuality. And I think all too often they're caught unawares, it seems. And Chavez was in that sense, I think, very prescient in the sense of trying to organize these regional associations precisely in order to help avoid or at least mitigate in some sense US actions. Of course, like I said, with the rightward drift of the region, that was no longer present. And I think that's one of the reasons that the sanctions regime of the US was able to barrel forwards in a way that probably would not have happened if there had been more left governments in the region.
I wonder if the video is prompting any thoughts about lessons learned from the reaction to the coup attempt. I know that Justin, earlier you brought up questions that you've had about whether the assumption is generally that there should have been less repression, and you've started to wonder if maybe it should have been the other way around. Of course, Maria earlier said that if Chavez hadn't called off the crowds, there would have been immense bloodshed. So I'm curious what you're all thinking as far as lessons learned in relation to all of that.
Well, with hindsight, it's easier to say there should have been more consequences for the perpetrators or fewer. If you look back at everything Chavez, we mentioned in the book, is very important. It's not often talked about. Chavez granted a very wide-ranging amnesty for the perpetrators of the first two coup attempts at the end of 2007, and I think that was partly due because of the lethargy and inefficiency of his public prosecutors, but it also is obviously partly a political calculation as well. Try to keep things peaceful and move things forward, because the country was progressing. But then when you look back at that amnesty, and you look back at it from now, standing here in 2021, it looks very different, because the same characters just kept trying again and have now subjected the country to these horrendous sanctions. And Juan Guaido deserves to be in jail 100 times over. I mean, and he's still at large. So obviously there are tactical reasons for not arresting him, but it's very difficult. So, and I think the reason we talk about it in the book, one key reason is to get people to think about. Everyone wants to criticize the Chavista governments, but to the extent there's a valid critique, it's kind of the opposite to the one the media has been telling us to make, like Justin alluded to. It's actually, they were, if anything, too lenient, too tolerant of seditionists backed by a foreign power. I mean, just think about Russiagate. I mean, it's a joke, right? I mean, they're talking about whether.
It's funny though, because when we were writing it, we kept asking the question in the book. What do you think would happen if somebody tried this in the U.S.? And then, of course, in January they sort of did, and so it's been kind of weird to watch it, the way that it's unfolded, right? Where there has been some degree of repression, and there's also been some toleration of the the coup plotters. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure the Americans in the audience and you, Rebecca, and Greg probably know much more about this than me, but.
Well, I think that you're right. I think that there has been, in some instances, too much leniency. But one thing that really we have to stress is the amount of betrayal that there has been within Venezuela by people placed very well. For example, Luis Ortega, who was the Attorney General. It was because of her that all of those people in 2014 who went out in the streets and shot and killed and burned people to death, all of a sudden, they didn't even go to jail. There was nothing put against them. This woman, then afterwards, we found out that she was giving millions of dollars by the Americans, okay? So in order to do that, to absolutely undermine the judicial system in Venezuela. And then we have Rafael Ramirez. Rafael Ramirez should be shot. In my mind, he has already been judged and sentenced by the Venezuelan government because this man single-handedly destroyed PDVSA. This is a man who was, it was lack of oversight too, because they made him Minister of Minister of Petroleum and President of PDVSA. So as President of PDVSA, guess who he had to show the books to? Himself. And so it was millions and millions in which he destroyed Venezuela. Venezuela's PDVSA sold its international 29 refineries, did everything to destroy one of the best oil companies in the world. So one of the things that, and while he's doing all this, Chavez was very ill. So all of this happened, and there was lack of oversight. This was a very powerful man, and they didn't know how to, get hold of him. So I think that now, having been buffeted by the United States, by Canada, by the EU, by the internal traitors to Venezuela, Guaidó, Ortega, Ramirez, Borges, I don't think there's much sort of forgiveness anymore in Venezuela. So if they try again, it's going to be very hard to just, turn the page.
I just want to make a quick comment about also this idea, the issue of amnesty and what roles that plays. I mean, I think Justin mentioned earlier that, well, giving amnesty doesn't really have an impact in terms of how the US will treat you afterwards. And I think that's certainly true, but I don't think that's really the main consideration on the part of the government. For example, for Chavez, I think when he gave amnesty, it was really more of a domestic consideration, not so much an international one. And these things always, it's very context bound. I mean, because for a long time they did try to prosecute the coup plotters. I mean, we're talking about years in the making, and it wasn't until 2006. I can't remember exactly what year now the amnesty passed, but it was several years after the coup. I think even 3 or 4 years later.
It was the end of 2000.
Pardon?
Right at the end of 2007, like just before New
2007, yes, exactly. So in 2006, Chavez got reelected, and he had an overwhelming majority at the time in the National Assembly, and was able to and replaced most of the, or actually what they called, packed the Supreme Court. And this was condemned internationally, left and right. I mean, even progressives condemned Chavez for doing that, but nobody understood the context in which that happened, which was that this was the Supreme Court, that is, the previous Supreme Court had exonerated everybody who had participated in the coup. They said there was a vacuum of power. They took the opposition line. And so I mean, it's just a mess in that sense, and people take these things out of context and just say, hey, the Chavez is packing the Supreme Court. He's, another reason to call him a dictator and so on. So these are things we have to pay attention to. I know it's a complicated situation, but of course the bottom line, and one of the biggest lessons here, is that we can't trust the mainstream media. As if you didn't know that.
I just
the big human rights organizations as well.
Just look at how the judges in the Supreme Court of the United States and in Canada are elected. Just look at those processes and tell me that there isn't a direction there from the powers that be as to who sits on those tribunals. So
well, yeah, and I always mention that Franklin Roosevelt, when he was trying to implement the New Deal, was having all of his New Deal legislation struck down by the Supreme Court, and he threatened to add members to the court, and they sort of backed off. So it's not without precedent in American history either.
Right. The tendency is to think about what lessons can be learned when you're talking about Venezuela, but what are the lessons that North Americans need to learn from all of this? This is a question to you all, obviously. But
I'd just like to make one really quick suggestion to people is, you know how there's a lot of effort put into demonizing Russia Today, press, TV, Telesur, any of the media that comes from the countries basically that the United States and its allies are trying to overthrow. So one really quick thing people can do is just check out those media as much as possible. You know, and Twitter will actually help you. They'll flag it for you. They'll say it's state-affiliated media.
That's helpful.
That's actually helpful.
Try to spend one day a week reading only things that have been flagged for you on Twitter.
You know, it's so important. I hope I'm clear. I'm not joking. Please do that because you'll
YouTube flags it as well.
What's that?
YouTube flags it as well.
YouTube, there you go. So they helps you. So do that because the emphasis is so much different. You'll see stories maybe that you could find if you looked hard enough in the corporate media, but often that you won't find it all, or that you'll find totally distorted or de-emphasized. So that's a really quick and easy way to work around of course there's independent media, there's Venezuela Analysis or Orinoco Tribune and Gray Zone, whatever. There's other media that's often vilified. Check them out because they're vilifying them for a reason. It's not because they give a damn about the quality of information or anything. It's because they're pointing out facts and giving you analysis that you're not finding elsewhere.
Well, yeah, just to add to that, this is a conclusion I only came to today, which is I kind of feel, and I hate to say, I'm not going to say who I heard it from, but some of you may recognize it. But I realized I heard this guy say this and I agreed with him, which is there's really nothing, no matter how bad the person is or how bad their political perspective is, there's nothing you should not read. Okay? Read the more widely you read, the more different perspectives you read, the better the chance that you're gonna find, a monthly review book and then it'll actually resonate with you, right? Like it obviously it's in my interest to say this because we're writing for a left-wing press and only people who read widely are ever going to see our book. But if it's at this point, like I feel like the imperialists' main method of censorship now these days is just to try to say, don't look at that, don't read that, don't look at those people. This person is, Julian Assange is, a sexual predator, so don't go to WikiLeaks, right? Like, Maduro is a bus driver, so don't listen to Venezuela. Like, whatever it is, like, it's just this kind of discrediting of the idea that you should go and look for any source except the ones that we, tell you are legitimate. So yeah, you've got to read widely. I think that's probably like the most important defense against this kind of propaganda at this point.
And I assume critically of all sources.
Yeah,
across the board, right?
Exactly.
You're not necessarily.
If you find a book about Venezuela that has just like dozens and dozens of pages of footnotes, just like from page 239 all the way to like page 300 and something, it's a well documented book,
Talking about extraordinary threat, obviously, right? It was originally half footnotes, I think, right? Okay, so we had a lot of questions that were sent in. We're not going to be able to answer all of them. So what I asked Justin and Joe to come up with kind of a set of answers that we would send people later. We'll post it on the YouTube page. We do have a YouTube page. It hasn't been active until basically now. It will become active. One of the questions, basically we had members of the audience ask specifically about Brazil, Nicaragua, Haiti, Iran, and Hong Kong. Okay, so we have probably about 15 minutes left. Obviously, we're not going to be able to deal with all of these different parts of the world. So I guess to bring it all together, you know, how can we extend the lessons learned when thinking about other parts of the world? And let's try to shift towards, I mean, you can give specific examples like Haiti, since it's obviously on people's minds, if you'd like. I see Justin thinking. Are you ready?
Oh yeah, sure. I can start us off. With you said Haiti, Nicaragua, Brazil, Hong Kong. Let me talk about Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is one I don't have specific knowledge of the Hong Kong demonstrations, the issue, and you know, what the demonstrations were about, and you know, the stakes of them. You know, I only really know what I've absorbed in the mainstream media, and like relatively recently I've been studying a little bit more closely. But I just wanted to say my approach, okay? And this was my approach to Syria. So I really did follow my own advice. So I found that a lot of people in the Palestine movement, for example, were saying we're joining the Assad must go for Syria kind of movement. And so they told me, you've got to read this one book. You know, I'm not going to tell you the book, but the point is I went and read that book, and I was totally appalled by how ridiculous the claims in the book were. And I was like, okay, so this is the best book that they tell me I have to read if I want to understand why people want to, you know, think that overthrowing the U.S. overthrow of this regime would be a good thing. And that's what helped me. So like the same goes for the Hong Kong thing. You have to look at what the Hong Kong protesters are saying, what they want. Look at the ones that you like. Look at the ones that you don't like. You know, look at what the claims that the Chinese government are saying, or the people that are, saying that the Hong Kong protests don't have merits. Really look at all of these sources and then come to your conclusion. And that's, and it's a tentative conclusion, but like, those are the ones where there's like a contentious, a really tough nut to crack in terms of the propaganda. That's all you can do. And then as far as Haiti or Nicaragua or Brazil go, the playbook, as you describe it, is so similar throughout the Americas and going back, more than 100 years now, about 120 years now, that, this you'll see the patterns. If you study one of them carefully, you'll see the patterns among the others.
So how do we know what to believe, really, truly? I mean, I think we talked previously, and it was, we agreed that we don't want to just leave it to the experts.
No.
We want to question all the experts. We need to make decisions for ourselves. But how do we make these decisions for ourselves? Well, and you said something about reserving judgment when you don't have all the information, but go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, I just wanted to simplify this question in a different way. That is, there's on the one hand, there's a legitimate effort, to try to understand what's happening in different countries, which can be very difficult and tricky to parse out, all the different points of view and the different analysis and the different, what's a fact and what's not a fact and what's been invented, what's, fake news, whatever. That can be a very difficult process. And I'm not going to get into the details of how you're going to figure that out. But I think there's another question that's actually more important for people in the United States, which is it right for the United States to try to overthrow any government in the world, period? And not only that, even if it were right, could we trust the US government to do the right thing? And I think the answer to both of those questions is actually no. In other words, regardless of what we think of, let's say, the government of Syria, or the government of Cuba, or the government of Venezuela, or the government of Belarus, or of North Korea, does the U.S. have any right to proclaim itself to be the arbiter of what kind of government it should have, and that it should be able to make the people of those countries to suffer through sanctions, or to suffer through an overthrow of the government, because that leads to similar effects in most cases. That is, an upheaval of the political and economic system in which ordinary people end up suffering. And I think the answer is very clear. And so there doesn't really need to be that we can separate those two issues, and regardless of what we think of the individual governments, we can still be absolutely opposed to US interventionism around the world, no matter where.
Yeah.
But listen,
Greg, it's a huge point. I mean, it doesn't matter, even if everything they claimed about Maduro were true, US policy would still be criminal and murderous. I mean, it would, in that sense, it makes no difference, right? But it's still important not to concede points that we have no business conceding. I mean, in the case of Saddam Hussein, I have no problem conceding that he was a brutal dictator, and his worst crimes were perpetrated while he had support of the United States. But still, that doesn't in no way justify what was done to Iraq. It can't. And people should be in jail for it, and they're not. And that's on us. That's what we should be pushing for.
Listen, if there is blood, of 100,000 Venezuelans have been estimated that have died because of the sanctions, because we couldn't get the insulin that they needed, the antivirals that they needed, all the medicine that is patented that we could not buy. So the sanctions are horrible, and they are the new hybrid war, but they are not bloodless.
Yeah, no, they're not blood. They're, in fact, I would say, sometimes people write that about, they compare, they talk about Venezuela's economic contraction and say it's like wartime. It's a worse contraction outside war. Well, it doesn't make any sense after 2017 to say it's not at war. I mean, it's at war with the United States. United States, when you're at war with a superpower, you basically have no other option but to duck and evade the blows that they rain on you. But it's a wartime situation at this point.
It is, yes.
It's a very one-sided war, because obviously Venezuela is not waging war against the US.
You're asking, Rebecca, what lessons can we learn? I want to know what lessons the United States has learned. For example, there was such horror in the United States that Russia had interfered in your precious elections. Well, what do you think the United States has been doing in intervening in all the elections of Venezuela and heaven knows how many other countries? Whenever there's an election in Venezuela, the Caracas had been full of spies coming from all sorts of the United States government trying to influence this. So the United States has been trying to influence democratic processes in Latin America. I wonder if the United States and Canada have learned, please leave us alone. You do not own Latin America. And I hope that they have learned something. It's they who have to learn from all these things that have happened.
So this has been a really generative conversation, and there's still so much more to discuss. But at this point, I'd like to thank Joe Emersberger and Justin Podur for writing Extraordinary Threat, and Maria and Greg for sharing their thoughts on the many questions that Extraordinary Threat sets to rest and evokes.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Calentando las trincheras.